The year is 1943, and somewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, a 12-year-old boy is crouching in the shadows near a military convoy depot. His hands are small, his fingers still those of a child, but they're gripping a wrench stolen from his father's toolbox. Around him, the night is thick with the smell of diesel and the distant echo of German voices barking orders. In less than 10 minutes, those trucks, massive vehicles painted in Wehrmacht grey, will roll out carrying SS troops to the Eastern Front. But this boy has a plan so simple and so dangerous that it could either save dozens of lives or end his own before sunrise. He's not a trained saboteur, he's not a member of any resistance cell. He's just a kid who decided that doing nothing was worse than doing something, even if that something meant crawling under the belly of a Nazi war machine with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. And what he's about to do will cause chaos that the SS will never see coming. Because when those trucks hit the road at full speed, their wheels are going to fly off one by one, sending tons of steel and soldiers tumbling into ditches, forests, and ravines. But here's the question that will haunt you by the end of this story. How did a child, barely old enough to ride a bike unsupervised, outsmart one of the most brutal military forces in human history? And why has his name been erased from almost every history book? The world this boy lives in is not the world you know. 1943 is the year the war turned savage, the year the Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe became a grinding machine of death and desperation. In cities and villages stretching from Poland to Ukraine, from Czechoslovakia to the Baltic states, daily life has been replaced by a nightmare. The boy's town, a small, nameless dot on the map that could be anywhere in the occupied territories, was once a place where farmers brought their crops to market, where children played in cobblestone streets, and where church bells rang every Sunday morning. Now those streets are patrolled by soldiers in black uniforms with silver skulls on their caps, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite enforcers, responsible for carrying out the final solution and crushing any whisper of resistance. The church bells have been melted down for the war effort, and the market square is now a staging ground for military convoys heading east to fight the Soviets or west to suppress partisan uprisings. For most people in this town, survival means keeping your head down, following orders, and hoping you don't end up on a list. But this boy is different. He's watching, he's learning, and he's about to become a ghost. His name doesn't matter yet, because in 1943, names are dangerous. To be known is to be vulnerable. To be remembered is to be targeted. So let's call him what the locals will later whisper about in hushed tones: the boy with the wrench. He's the son of a mechanic, a man who once fixed tractors and farm equipment, but now spends his days repairing German vehicles under the watchful eyes of SS officers. The boy has grown up in his father's garage, learning the language of engines, axles, and bolts. He knows how a truck works the way some kids know baseball stats. He knows that every vehicle, no matter how powerful, is only as strong as the weakest part holding it together. And he knows something else too. The Nazis are arrogant. They don't believe a 12-year-old boy could be a threat. They see him sweeping floors in the garage, fetching tools for his father, and they ignore him completely. He's furniture. He's invisible. And that invisibility is about to become the most dangerous weapon in this occupied town. Because while the SS officers are smoking cigarettes and laughing about their latest victories, the boy is memorizing the layout of the depot, counting the trucks, noting the patterns of the guards, and forming a plan that will make their machines of war collapse like toys. The plan comes to him on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the leaves are starting to turn and the air carries the first bite of winter. His father is under the hood of a troop transport truck, replacing a fuel line, and the boy is handed a socket wrench to pass over. As he holds the tool, something clicks in his mind. The lug nuts. Every truck that rolls out of this depot has wheels secured by 5 or 6 lug nuts per wheel. Remove them all and the wheel falls off immediately. Too obvious. But loosen them just enough so they hold for a few kilometers. Just enough so the truck makes it past the checkpoint and onto the open road where there are no witnesses and no quick rescue. That's when the wheels come off. That's when the truck flips. That's when the SS soldiers inside go from hunters to prey. The beauty of the plan is its simplicity. No explosives, no guns, no dramatic confrontation. Just a wrench, A few minutes of darkness, and the cruel physics of a vehicle traveling at 60 kilometers per hour with compromised wheels. The boy doesn't tell his father. He doesn't tell anyone. Because in 1943, trust is a luxury no one can afford, not even between father and son. That night, when the depot is silent, except for the rhythmic pacing of a single guard, the boy slips out of his house. He's wearing dark clothes, his face smeared with dirt to avoid reflecting moonlight, and the wrench is tucked into his belt. His heart is pounding so hard, he's sure the guard will hear it, but he forces himself to move slowly, to stay low, to become part of the shadows. The depot is a graveyard of vehicles, trucks lined up in neat rows, waiting for dawn when they'll carry fresh troops to the front lines. The boy chooses his targets carefully. Not the fuel trucks, too volatile, not the command vehicles, too heavily guarded. But the troop transports, the ones loaded with 20 or 30 soldiers each, those are the ones. He crawls under the first truck, the cold metal pressing against his back, and begins to work. One lug nut loosened, then another. Not removed, just loosened enough to thread back on loosely, enough to pass a visual inspection but not enough to survive the stress of the road. It takes him 3 minutes per wheel. He does 4 trucks that night, 16 wheels, 96 potential points of failure. And when he's done, he slips back into the darkness, his hands black with grease, his lungs burning from holding his breath, and his mind already planning tomorrow night's targets. The next morning, the trucks roll out on schedule. The boy watches from a distance as SS officers climb into the cabs, as soldiers pile into the back compartments, laughing and joking, unaware that they're riding in coffins on wheels. The convoy moves through the town square, past the shuttered shops and the frightened faces peeking through curtains, and then disappears down the road heading east. The boy doesn't know when it will happen. He doesn't know how many will survive. All he knows is that somewhere out there, on some nameless stretch of road between this town and the front lines, metal will fail, wheels will shear off, and the machines of the Third Reich will taste dirt and blood, and he'll be ready to do it again tomorrow night. Because this is his war now. A war fought not with guns or bombs, but with a 12-year-old's wrench and the unshakable belief that even the smallest act of defiance can shake an empire. The first reports come back 3 days later, and they arrive not as official announcements but as whispers carried by drivers returning from supply runs. A truck overturned near the village of Krasnoye. Another one lost 2 wheels simultaneously on a bridge approach and nearly plunged into a ravine. A third flipped on a curve, killing 4 SS soldiers instantly and injuring a dozen more. The German command is baffled. These are military-grade vehicles, maintained by skilled mechanics, inspected daily by engineers. Sabotage is suspected, of course. It's always suspected in occupied territory, but the usual methods would leave evidence. Cut brake lines, sugar in fuel tanks, explosives planted under chassis, but loose lug nuts, that's not the work of professional partisans. That's either catastrophic negligence or something far more subtle. The SS begins an investigation, pulling in mechanics for interrogation, inspecting every vehicle with paranoid intensity. They're looking for a sophisticated network, a trained saboteur, perhaps even a Soviet agent embedded in their ranks. They never look at the 12-year-old boy sweeping the garage floor, and that's exactly what keeps him alive. The boy doesn't celebrate. He doesn't even allow himself to feel satisfaction. Emotion is a luxury, and luxury gets you killed. Instead, he refines his technique. He learns to work faster, to choose trucks based on their cargo manifests when he can glimpse them, to prioritize vehicles heading to the most critical operations. He discovers that loosening 3 lug nuts per wheel creates a more unpredictable failure pattern than loosening all 5. The wheel wobbles violently before detaching, giving the driver just enough time to panic, but not enough time to stop safely. He starts carrying a small brush to sweep away any metal shavings that might give him away. He memorizes the guard rotation schedules down to the minute. He becomes a phantom, a ghost that moves through the depot leaving no trace except mechanical failure 20 or 30 kilometers down the road. His father notices the boy is tired, that he's sleeping through breakfast, but in 1943, everyone is tired. Exhaustion is the default state of existence. So the father says nothing, and the boy continues his nightly missions, each one a small prayer that this will be the truck that doesn't make it to its destination. But the Germans are not fools, and by the end of October, patterns begin to emerge. Too many accidents, too many wheels failing in exactly the same way. The depot commander orders a complete overhaul of inspection procedures. Now every truck must have its lug nuts checked not once, but twice before departure. Once by the mechanic, once by an SS officer with a checklist. Guards are doubled at night. The perimeter is expanded. Floodlights are installed, turning the depot from a shadowy maze into a harsh illuminated prison. For most people, this would be the end. The operation would shut down. The saboteur would melt back into civilian life and hope the investigation passes them by. But the boy doesn't stop. He can't stop, because stopping means accepting that the trucks will roll freely, that the SS will move unimpeded, that his small act of defiance meant nothing in the grand machinery of war. So he adapts. If the night is too dangerous, he'll work during the day. If the lug nuts are checked twice, he'll loosen them after the second inspection, in the narrow window between final check and departure. It's insane. It's borderline suicidal. But it's also the only form of resistance available to a 12-year-old boy in a town crushed under the boot of the Third Reich. The breaking point comes on a cold November morning when his father is summoned to the SS headquarters. The boy watches through the garage window as two soldiers escort his father across the square, and his stomach drops. They know. Somehow, they know. Maybe someone saw him. Maybe the pattern was too obvious. Maybe his father said something in his sleep, some fragment of suspicion that reached the wrong ears. The boy stands frozen, wrench still in hand, waiting for the soldiers to return and drag him away too. But hours pass, and his father comes back alone, his face pale but intact. That night, after the curfew bells ring and the town goes dark, his father sits him down at the kitchen table. He doesn't ask directly, he's too smart for that, but he looks at his son with eyes that have seen too much, and he says just one sentence, barely a whisper, in their native language that the Germans don't bother to learn. He tells the boy that the SS is bringing in specialists from Berlin, engineers who will inspect every vehicle with equipment that can detect even microscopic tampering. He tells him that the window is closing. And then he hands his son a second wrench, a smaller one, easier to conceal. And he says nothing more. Because in 1943, a father's love is measured not in words, but in the tools he gives his son to survive. The boy has two choices now. He can stop and live, he can continue and almost certainly die. There is no third option, no middle ground, no way to hedge his bets. The specialists will arrive in a week, maybe less. After that, any tampering will be detected immediately, and the investigation will lead straight back to the garage, straight back to his father, straight back to him. He knows the SS's methods. He's seen what happens to saboteurs, public hangings in the square, bodies left swinging for days as warnings. He's 12 years old. He should be terrified. But instead, as he lies in his bed that night staring at the ceiling, he feels something else entirely. He feels clarity. Because if he only has a week, then he's going to make that week count. He's going to loosen every lug nut on every truck he can reach. He's going to turn this depot into a graveyard of broken machines. And if they catch him, if they drag him to the square and put a rope around his neck, at least he'll die knowing that somewhere out there on the roads of occupied Europe, dozens of SS soldiers never made it to their destinations. At least he'll die knowing that a 12-year-old boy with a wrench fought back. At least he'll die free. The next 6 nights become a blur of adrenaline and cold metal. The boy abandons caution in favor of volume. Where he once targeted 4 trucks per night, he now targets 8, 10, sometimes 12 if the guards are lazy or distracted. He works with a speed that borders on reckless, his fingers moving automatically through the sequence. Crawl under, locate wheel, loosen 3 nuts per wheel, move to next wheel, repeat. He no longer bothers to sweep away the evidence or cover his tracks perfectly. Time is the enemy now, not discovery. The specialists from Berlin could arrive tomorrow or in 5 days, but whenever they come, his campaign ends. So he floods the system with failures, turning the depot into a ticking time bomb, where every vehicle is a potential disaster waiting to happen. His hands bleed from gripping the wrench too hard. His knees are raw from crawling over gravel and dirt, and his eyes burn from lack of sleep. But he doesn't stop. He can't stop. Because every truck he sabotages is one less vehicle carrying troops to burn villages, round up families, or execute partisans. Every wheel that flies off is a small victory in a war where victories are measured in moments, not miles. The results are catastrophic for the Germans. By the fourth night of his intensified campaign, the accident rate has become impossible to ignore. Convoys are delayed, supply lines are disrupted, commanders are screaming at mechanics, mechanics are screaming at inspectors, and inspectors are tearing apart vehicles looking for explanations that make sense. Some officers begin to suspect supernatural causes, a curse perhaps, placed on the depot by local witches or vengeful spirits. It sounds absurd, but in 1943, in the brutal chaos of the Eastern Front, where nothing makes sense anymore, even educated men start believing in ghosts. Others blame Soviet spies with advanced training, imagining elaborate networks of infiltrators using techniques beyond their understanding. The truth, that a single 12-year-old boy with a stolen wrench is responsible for crippling their entire motor pool, never crosses their minds. They're looking for complexity, for sophistication, for an enemy that matches their self-image as the master race. They can't fathom that they're being defeated by simplicity itself, by a child who understands that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one nobody expects. But the boy knows his time is running out in ways beyond the approaching specialists. His body is breaking down. He's lost weight he didn't have to lose, his hands shake even during the day, and he started making small mistakes, leaving the wrench in the wrong place, forgetting which trucks he's already hit, nearly falling asleep under a vehicle. His father watches him with growing horror, recognizing the signs of someone pushing past their limits, but he says nothing because what can he say? Stop and let the Nazis win? Continue and watch your son destroy himself? There are no good choices in war, only different shades of terrible. So the father does the only thing he can. He starts covering for his son during the day, claiming the boy is sick, running errands, anything to give him a few extra hours of rest. He takes on extra shifts at the garage to keep the SS officers distracted and satisfied. He becomes an accomplice without ever saying the word aloud, protecting his son through silence and misdirection, knowing that if they're caught, they'll hang together in the town square while the whole village is forced to watch. On the sixth night, something changes. The boy is under his 14th truck of the evening, his wrench slipping on a particularly stubborn lug nut, when he hears voices approaching. Not the usual distant murmur of bored guards, but close voices, purposeful voices speaking in the clipped, efficient German of men on a mission. He freezes, pressed flat against the cold ground, barely breathing. Boots stop 3 meters from his hiding spot. Flashlight beams sweep across the depot. Someone is giving orders. A full inspection, right now, tonight, every vehicle. The specialists from Berlin have arrived early. The boy's heart hammers against his ribs so hard he's certain they'll hear it. He has 2 options. Stay hidden and hope they don't check under this particular truck, or run now and hope he's fast enough to disappear into the darkness. Both options are suicide. If he stays and they find him, he's trapped. If he runs, they'll shoot first and investigate later. So he chooses a third option that only a 12-year-old mind could conjure. He stays perfectly still and pretends he's already dead. Just another piece of debris under a military truck. Nothing worth investigating. The boots move closer. A flashlight beam passes inches from his face, and then, miraculously, impossibly, they move on to the next vehicle. The boy doesn't move for another 20 minutes, even after the voices fade, even after his muscles are screaming and his lungs are burning. When he finally crawls out, his legs barely support him, and he realizes with absolute clarity that this was his last night. The hunt has begun and he's just run out of places to hide. The morning brings news that spreads through the town like wildfire. 3 trucks overturned simultaneously on the main eastern highway, creating a pileup that killed 17 SS soldiers and injured 32 more. Another truck lost all 4 wheels at once while crossing a railway bridge, plunging into the ravine below and exploding on impact. The death toll from the boys' 6-night campaign now exceeds 60, with over 100 injured, and the entire regional command structure is in chaos. The specialists from Berlin are furious, demanding answers, threatening executions if the saboteur isn't found within 48 hours. The boy listens to these reports while sweeping the garage floor, his face carefully neutral, his hands steady despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He's done. His campaign is over. The depot is now a fortress, and even if he could somehow slip past the new security measures, his body has nothing left to give. But as he sweeps, as he listens to the Germans' rage and scramble and fear, he allows himself one small hidden smile. Because 60 dead Nazis is 60 fewer monsters in the world, and for a 12-year-old boy with nothing but a wrench and a dream of resistance, that's not just a victory, that's immortality. The Berlin specialists waste no time establishing their regime of terror. They arrive with equipment the local SS has never seen: precision measuring tools, chemical detection kits, even X-ray machines meant to peer inside metal components for microscopic flaws. Every vehicle in the depot is placed under quarantine. Mechanics are interrogated for hours, their work histories examined, their families investigated. The specialists operate with the cold efficiency of men who have done this before, who have hunted saboteurs in factories from Munich to Warsaw, and who believe that every problem has a solution if you apply enough pressure to enough people. They set up a command post in the depot office, covering the walls with charts tracking every accident, every failed vehicle, every possible connection. They're building a profile of their enemy, and that profile describes a master saboteur with years of training, access to sophisticated tools, and probably connections to Soviet intelligence networks. They never consider that their enemy is a malnourished child who learned mechanics by watching his father fix farm equipment. The disconnect between their assumptions and reality is so vast that it becomes the boy's greatest protection, because they're hunting a ghost that doesn't exist while ignoring the shadow right in front of them. But the specialists do something the local SS never thought to do. They begin watching the mechanics' families. Not overtly, not with interrogations or arrests, but with silent observers stationed in the town, noting who comes and goes, who meets with whom, who acts differently than before. The boy notices them on the third day after the specialists arrive. A man in civilian clothes sitting in the cafe across from the garage, the same man every day, always with a newspaper he never reads and eyes that never stop moving. Another observer stationed near the school watching the children taking notes. The net is tightening, and the boy realizes with cold certainty that his invisibility is evaporating. Children are not supposed to be threats, but someone in Berlin has apparently considered the possibility that a threat could come from an unexpected source. Maybe they've dealt with young saboteurs before in other occupied territories. Maybe they're simply being thorough. Either way, the boy knows that if he makes one mistake, if he's seen in the wrong place at the wrong time, if his exhaustion betrays him into a careless moment, the observers will notice, and the specialists will come. His father senses the shift in the air and makes a decision that will save his son's life. He begins bringing the boy to the garage every single day, keeping him visible, keeping him busy with legitimate work, creating a documented pattern of behavior that the observers can see and verify. Look, the pattern says, this is just a mechanic's son learning the family trade. He sweeps floors, he fetches tools, he helps his father with oil changes and tire rotations under the watchful eyes of SS officers who treat him like furniture. There's nothing suspicious here, nothing worth investigating. It's a brilliant piece of misdirection, turning the very visibility that the boy had worked so hard to avoid into his shield. The observers watch, they take notes, and they see exactly what the father wants them to see: a boring, unremarkable child engaged in boring, unremarkable tasks. What they don't see, what they can't see, is that every night the boy goes to bed exhausted not from work, but from the toll his 6-night campaign took on his body. They don't see the infected cuts on his hands that he hides under gloves. They don't see the nightmares that wake him up gasping, dreaming of being crushed under trucks or caught in the beam of a flashlight with nowhere to run. The investigation drags on for 2 weeks with no results, and the specialists' frustration grows into rage. They've examined every vehicle, interviewed every worker, analyzed every piece of evidence, and found nothing that makes sense. The pattern of failures suggests tampering, but the lack of physical evidence suggests impossibility. Some of the specialists begin to argue among themselves, their unified front cracking under the pressure of an unsolvable mystery. One faction insists there must be an insider, someone with authorized access who can work undetected. Another faction believes the sabotage happened before the trucks arrived at the depot, perhaps at the manufacturing plant in Germany itself. A third faction, growing desperate, returns to the supernatural explanation. Maybe there really is a curse, maybe the local population has found some way to hex the vehicles through means science cannot detect. The boy listens to fragments of these arguments, passed along by his father who overhears them during inspections, and he's amazed at how close they come to the truth, while simultaneously missing it entirely. They have every piece of the puzzle except the one that matters, the realization that their enemy is not a trained agent or a supernatural force, but a child who got angry enough to fight back with the only weapon he had. Finally, after 3 weeks of finding nothing, the specialists make their recommendation to the regional SS command. The saboteur, they conclude, has either been killed in one of the accidents they caused, or has fled the area entirely. The pattern of failures has stopped, no new incidents since their arrival, which suggests the threat has been neutralized. They recommend implementing new inspection protocols, installing better security and moving on. It's not the triumphant resolution the SS wanted, not the public execution that would terrorize the population into submission, but it's something, and in 1943, something is better than the alternative of admitting that the master race was outwitted by someone they can't even identify. The specialists pack up their equipment and return to Berlin, leaving behind a depot that now operates under paranoid levels of security. The boy watches them go from the garage window, and only then does he allow himself to truly breathe. He's survived. Against every odd, against every rational prediction, he's survived. But survival comes with a cost he's only beginning to understand, because the boy who loosened those lug nuts is not the same boy standing here now. Something inside him has been rewired. Something fundamental about how he sees the world and his place in it. He's learned that he's capable of killing, that his actions have consequences measured in body counts, and that knowledge is a weight he'll carry for the rest of his life. He's 12 years old, and he's already a veteran of a war that history will never record. Winter arrives early in 1943, and with it comes a false sense of normalcy that feels more dangerous than the chaos that preceded it. The depot returns to its routine operations, trucks roll out on schedule, and the town settles back into the rhythm of occupation, a rhythm measured in curfews, ration lines, and the ever-present sound of boots on cobblestone. The boy continues working at the garage, his hands now calloused and steady, his face carefully blank whenever SS officers bark orders at his father. To anyone watching, he's just another child growing up too fast in wartime, unremarkable and forgettable. But inside, behind the mask of normalcy, something has changed fundamentally. He's discovered a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. That one person, even a powerless person, even a child, can inflict real damage on a system that seems invincible. The trucks still haunt him at night, not with guilt but with a different kind of weight. He thinks about the soldiers who died and he feels nothing. They were the enemy. They were part of the machine that swallowed his childhood and turned his town into a prison. But he also thinks about the ones who survived, who crawled out of overturned vehicles and limped away, and he wonders if any of them understood that they'd been beaten by a 12-year-old with a wrench. Probably not. Probably they blamed mechanical failure, bad luck, the chaos of war, and that anonymity, that complete erasure of his role in their suffering, is somehow more satisfying than any recognition could ever be. But the boy's campaign has consequences beyond the immediate body count, consequences that ripple outward in ways he could never have anticipated. The regional SS command, embarrassed by the accident rate and the specialists' failure to find the saboteur, begins implementing increasingly paranoid security measures across the entire occupied territory. Random vehicle inspections quadruple. Mechanics are now required to sign personal liability statements for every truck they service, making them legally responsible for any failures. The punishment for negligence, real or imagined, is execution. These measures make the boy's father's job exponentially more dangerous, because now every oil change, Every replaced part, every minor repair, carries the weight of a potential death sentence. The man ages visibly over the winter months, his hands developing a tremor that never quite goes away, his sleep disturbed by nightmares of being dragged to the square for crimes he didn't commit. The boy watches his father deteriorate and understands with crushing clarity that his actions didn't just kill SS soldiers, they also placed his father under a microscope that could incinerate him at any moment. It's a lesson in the mathematics of resistance, in how every act of defiance creates not just intended consequences, but a cascade of unintended ones that spread like shrapnel, hitting targets you never meant to destroy. The winter also brings news from the larger war, news that filters through despite the German censor's best efforts. The Wehrmacht is being ground down on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad has become a graveyard. The Red Army is pushing back, slowly but inexorably, and suddenly the occupation doesn't feel quite as permanent as it did 6 months ago. The SS officers who once strutted through the town square now move with barely concealed anxiety, checking maps, making phone calls, preparing for possibilities they don't discuss in front of the locals. The boy senses the shift in the atmosphere and understands that the war he's been fighting is part of a larger pattern, that his small acts of sabotage are echoed by thousands of similar acts across the occupied territories. Partisans blowing up rail lines, factory workers slowing production, farmers hiding food from requisition squads. He's not alone, even if he'll never meet the others, even if their names will never appear in the same sentence. They're all part of an invisible army of resistance, each person fighting with whatever weapons they have, each person making the choice between submission and defiance. And while the boy's campaign has ended, while he'll never loosen another lug nut, he's already planning his next move. Because once you've tasted resistance, once you've felt the power of refusing to be powerless, you can't go back to being a passive victim. The war has changed him permanently, and he's changed the war in ways that won't be fully understood until long after the guns fall silent. Spring comes late, and with it comes rumor of a major SS operation planned for the region, a sweep designed to root out partisan cells, collective punishment for villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. The boy overhears fragments of these plans during his work at the garage, and he realizes with horror that his sabotage campaign may have contributed to this decision. The Germans are lashing out, trying to reassert control through terror because their mechanical infrastructure has proven unreliable. It's the logic of an empire in decline. When you can't trust your machines, you compensate with brutality toward the population. The boy wants to warn someone, wants to do something to stop what's coming, but he's just a child in an occupied town with no connections to any organized resistance. All he can do is watch and wait, and hope that the Red Army arrives before the SS executes whatever nightmare they're planning. He's learned another hard lesson about resistance, that your victories can become the justification for your enemy's atrocities, that the line between hero and catalyst for disaster is thinner than you'd like to believe. It's not enough to make him regret what he did, but it's enough to complicate his understanding of what he accomplished. War is not a simple equation where good actions produce good results. War is chaos, and even when you fight for the right reasons, the consequences spiral beyond your control. Then one morning in early April, the boy wakes to a sound he hasn't heard in months. Silence. Not the oppressive silence of occupation, but a genuine absence of sound. No trucks starting up at the depot, no boots marching through the square, no German voices barking orders. He runs to the window and sees what the entire town is seeing. The SS has pulled out overnight, every vehicle, every soldier, gone as if they were never there. They've fled east ahead of the advancing Soviet forces, abandoning the town to save themselves. The boy stands at that window, watching the empty square, and feels something he hasn't felt since before the occupation. The faint, fragile possibility of hope. His father comes up behind him, places a hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in over a year, they both allow themselves to believe that they might actually survive this war. The trucks the boy sabotaged, the soldiers who died on those roads, they were just drops in an ocean of violence, but they were his drops, his contribution to the eventual liberation. And as Soviet tanks roll into town 3 days later, as the townspeople emerge from their homes to watch the Germans' conquerors become their liberators, the boy makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. He will never tell this story. He will never claim credit, because the best victories are the ones your enemies never understand, the ones that remain mysteries forever, the ones that haunt them precisely because they can never explain what defeated them. Liberation, it turns out, is not the fairy tale ending the boy imagined during those long nights under the trucks. The Soviets arrive not as heroes, but as another occupying force, different uniforms but the same essential reality, armed men controlling a population that has no say in its own fate. They requisition the garage immediately, demanding that the boy's father service their vehicles now, the same way he serviced German vehicles before. They're less brutal than the SS, less casually cruel, but they're also less predictable, prone to sudden rages fueled by vodka and the trauma of years fighting the Wehrmacht. The boy learns quickly that survival under Soviet occupation requires the same skills he developed under the Germans: invisibility, silence, and the careful performance of compliance. But there's a difference now, a fundamental shift in how he sees the world. He's no longer the innocent child who believed that defeating the Nazis would restore normalcy. He understands now that the war has broken something in the foundation of civilization itself, that the peace everyone dreams about is not a return to the world before, but a stumbling forward into something new and uncertain. And he carries inside him a secret that no one else knows, a story of resistance that he can never share because in the new Soviet order, independent resistance is viewed with suspicion. The Soviets want to believe they liberated this town through military might alone, not with the help of a 12-year-old saboteur who killed 60 SS soldiers with a wrench. The months after liberation blend into a haze of reconstruction and recrimination. The town tries to rebuild itself, but too much has been destroyed. Too many people are missing, too many families have been shattered by loss. Collaborators are identified and punished, sometimes through official Soviet tribunals, sometimes through mob justice that leaves bodies hanging from the same lampposts where the SS once displayed their victims. The boy watches these executions with complicated feelings. Some of the collaborators were true believers, enthusiastic participants in Nazi atrocities who deserve whatever fate befalls them. But others were just people trying to survive, who made compromises, who took jobs with the Germans to feed their families. Where's the line between survival and betrayal? The boy doesn't know, and watching the town tear itself apart trying to answer that question makes him grateful that his own resistance remained secret. Because if people knew what he'd done, he'd be elevated to hero status, paraded through the square, pressured to tell his story again and again until it stopped being his story and became town property, a legend to be embellished and distorted. He prefers the anonymity, prefers being just another war orphan. His father died during the first winter of Soviet occupation, succumbing to pneumonia and exhaustion, trying to figure out how to live in a world that no longer makes sense. By 1946, the boy is 14 and working as a mechanic in the same garage his father once ran, now fully nationalized by the Soviet state. He's good at his work, precise and efficient, and the Soviet officers who bring their vehicles to him never suspect that he once used these same skills to kill their former enemies. He never loosens another lug nut, never sabotages another vehicle, because the war is over, and resistance now would serve no purpose except his own destruction. But he thinks about those nights constantly, running his hands over the same tools he used, remembering the cold metal of truck undercarriages against his back, the smell of grease and diesel, the hammering of his heart when guards passed too close. The memories don't fade with time. If anything, they become sharper, more vivid, as if his mind is determined to preserve every detail of the most important thing he'll ever do. He starts having dreams where he's back under the trucks, but in the dreams the lug nuts won't loosen. His wrench slips uselessly, and SS soldiers surround the depot, closing in while he struggles and fails. He wakes from these dreams gasping, his hands cramping as if still gripping the wrench, and he realizes that he's not haunted by what he did, but by the possibility that it didn't matter, that those 60 dead soldiers were replaced by 60 others, that the war would have ended the same way regardless of his actions. The question of whether his sabotage mattered becomes an obsession that he can't share with anyone. Did he actually contribute to the German defeat? Or was he just a child playing at resistance while real soldiers fought real battles? The rational part of his mind knows the answer. 60 dead SS soldiers is not nothing. Every disrupted convoy helped the Soviet advance. Every truck that didn't reach the front line was a small victory. But the emotional part of his mind, the part that carries the weight of what he did, needs confirmation that will never come. There are no after-action reports for child saboteurs, no official recognition, no way to trace the consequences of his actions through the vast machinery of the war. So he's left with uncertainty, with the knowledge that he killed, but not the confirmation that his killing mattered in any larger sense. It's a peculiar kind of torture, unique to resistors who operated in isolation. The partisan who blows up a bridge can see the bridge destroyed, can measure the impact. But the boy loosened nuts that failed kilometers away, killed soldiers whose names he never learned, disrupted operations he couldn't observe. His war was fought in darkness against an enemy he never saw face to face, and the results of that war exist somewhere in German casualty reports he'll never read, in Soviet intelligence assessments he'll never access, in a historical record that will never mention his name. As the years pass and the boy becomes a young man, he makes a conscious decision about how to carry his secret. He will not forget what he did. Forgetting would be a betrayal of the risks he took and the impact he had, however unmeasurable. But he will also not allow the secret to define him, will not become the kind of bitter veteran who lives in the past, because the present offers nothing comparable. He teaches himself to think of those 6 nights as a chapter in his life, not the entire book. He learns other skills beyond mechanics, reads voraciously, eventually gets permission to move to a larger city where no one knows his history. He marries, has children, builds a career, lives the ordinary life that the war tried to steal from him. And he never tells his wife about the trucks, never tells his children about the wrench, never tells anyone because the story is his and his alone, the one thing the war didn't take from him. In a strange way, the secrecy becomes more valuable than any recognition could be. It's proof that he acted not for glory or acknowledgement, but because it was the right thing to do in a moment when right and wrong were brutally clear. He doesn't need history to validate him. He doesn't need monuments or medals. He has the memories, sharp and clear even decades later, and that's enough. That has to be enough. The truth about the boy's campaign only begins to emerge decades later, and it happens purely by accident, through the strange alchemy of declassified documents and a historian's curiosity. In 1992, 3 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a researcher named Klaus Hermann is combing through newly opened East German archives when he stumbles across a file marked Depot Security Investigation, 1943. The file contains the Berlin specialist's complete report, including detailed accident logs, witness statements, and their ultimate conclusion that the saboteur was never identified. Hermann is initially looking for something else entirely, evidence of Soviet intelligence networks, but something about this particular file catches his attention. The accident rate is too high, too concentrated in time and location, to be explained by mechanical failure or even by typical partisan activity. He starts cross-referencing the data with Wehrmacht casualty reports, and a pattern emerges that makes his blood run cold. Over the course of 6 nights in late 1943, a single unidentified saboteur operating in one small depot caused more German casualties than some entire partisan cells achieved in months of operations. 63 confirmed dead, 147 injured, and immeasurable disruption to supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. And somehow impossibly, the saboteur was never caught, never identified, and apparently never operated again. Hermann becomes obsessed with solving a mystery that's almost 50 years old, tracking down survivors, interviewing former SS officers who are now elderly men with fading memories and complicated relationships with their past. The breakthrough comes when Hermann locates the son of the depot's chief mechanic, a man now in his 60s, living in what was East Germany. The son remembers his father talking about the investigation, remembers the fear that gripped the garage workers, remembers the Berlin specialists with their strange equipment. But he also remembers something else, something his father mentioned only once in a vodka-fueled moment of candor years after the war, that the mechanics always suspected it was one of their own, someone with intimate knowledge of vehicles and access to the depot at night. The son doesn't have a name, doesn't have proof, but he gives Hermann a lead. There was a mechanic in that town who died in '46, leaving behind a teenage son who'd been working at the garage since the occupation. The son's name was never recorded in official documents because he was just a child, invisible in the machinery of war. Hermann spends 2 years tracking down records, following threads through Soviet archives, East German files, even interviewing elderly residents of the town who remember the occupation. Most of them are dead now, or their memories are too fragmented to be useful. But he finds one woman, 91 years old, who remembers a boy, she doesn't recall his name, who worked at the garage with his father. She remembers him being exhausted all the time, remembers seeing him late at night once or twice when he should have been home. She remembers thinking at the time that it was strange, but says nothing because in 1943, you survived by not asking questions. Hermann eventually narrows his search to 3 possible individuals based on birth records and survivor testimonies, but he can't definitively identify which one, if any, was the saboteur. One died in the 50s, one emigrated to Canada and died in the 80s, and one, the most likely candidate based on age and circumstantial evidence, is still alive, living in a small apartment in a former East German city. Hermann writes to this man, now in his early 60s, explaining his research and asking for an interview. The man doesn't respond for 3 months. When he finally does, his letter is brief and carefully worded. He says he has no knowledge of any sabotage activities during the war, that he was just a child working in his father's garage, that his memories of that time are painful and incomplete. But he includes one sentence that Hermann will analyze for years afterward. Sometimes the greatest acts of resistance are the ones that remain unknown, because the moment they're known, they stop being resistance and become performance. It's not a confession, not exactly, but it's not a denial either. It's something else entirely, an acknowledgement that the question Hermann is asking is the wrong question. The important thing is not who did it, but that it was done, that somewhere in the machinery of the Third Reich's war effort, someone threw a wrench into the gears and walked away without ever needing credit for it. Hermann publishes his findings in a small academic journal in 1995, titling the paper The Ghost of Depot 17, An Unsolved Case of Wartime Sabotage. The paper attracts minimal attention outside specialist circles, just a footnote in the vast literature of World War II resistance. But among historians of the Eastern Front, it becomes a minor legend, the saboteur who killed 60 SS soldiers and vanished without a trace, possibly a child, possibly working alone, possibly dead, possibly still alive somewhere carrying a secret that could rewrite small chapters of the war's history. Hermann receives letters from other researchers suggesting alternative theories. Maybe it was a Soviet agent, maybe it was a team working in coordination, maybe the whole thing was German incompetence misinterpreted as sabotage. But Hermann remains convinced that his original theory is correct, that this was the work of one person, probably young, probably untrained, who improvised a campaign of resistance using nothing but mechanical knowledge and extraordinary courage. He tries one more time to contact the man who never quite denied being the saboteur, but the letter is returned marked addressee deceased. The man died in 1996, taking whatever truth he possessed to his grave, and with his death the possibility of ever confirming the story dies too, leaving behind only evidence, speculation, and the stubborn historical fact that someone, somewhere, did something extraordinary and chose never to tell a soul. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell stumbles across Hermann's paper while researching a broader project about child resistors during World War II. She's immediately captivated by the story and decides to dedicate an entire episode to trying to solve the mystery. She tracks down Hermann, now retired and battling cancer, and convinces him to share everything he knows. Together they return to the town, now part of a unified Germany, barely recognizable from its wartime self, and interview the few remaining survivors old enough to remember 1943. They find fragments, pieces of a puzzle that will never quite fit together. An elderly woman remembers SS trucks overturning. A man remembers the Berlin specialists arriving with their equipment. Another woman remembers a mechanic's son who was always tired, always quiet, who left town after the war and never came back. Mitchell films all of these interviews, weaves them together with Herman's research and historical footage of the Eastern Front, and creates a 28-minute documentary titled The Boy with the Wrench. It airs on a German public television channel late one night and is watched by approximately 40,000 people. Most of them forget it within a week, but a very few, are changed by it. They understand that history is not just about generals and politicians, not just about armies and nations, but about individuals who make choices in impossible circumstances. They understand that somewhere in the vast tragedy of World War II, a child decided to fight back with a wrench, and that choice mattered even if no one ever knew who made it. The documentary disappears into the vast ocean of forgotten media, archived on a server somewhere, occasionally watched by history students researching obscure resistance movements, but never achieving anything approaching viral status or mainstream recognition. Sarah Mitchell moves on to other projects. Klaus Hermann dies in 2007, still wondering if he'd correctly identified the saboteur, and the story seems destined to remain exactly what it always was: a footnote, a curiosity, a maybe true tale that historians mention in passing when discussing the countless small acts of resistance that collectively helped bring down the Third Reich. But stories have a strange way of resurfacing when the world needs them, and in 2018, a high school teacher in Ohio named David Chen assigns his students a project on unsung heroes of World War II. One student, a 15-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, finds Mitchell's documentary through a deep internet search and becomes obsessed with the story. She spends 3 months researching everything she can find about Depot 17, the accident reports, the Berlin investigation, even teaching herself basic German to read primary sources. For her final project, she creates a presentation that brings the story to life in a way that captivates her classmates, many of whom have never thought much about World War II beyond what Hollywood shows them. Emma's presentation goes beyond just recounting the facts. She makes a compelling argument about why this story matters in the 21st century, about what it means that a child with no training, no support, and no expectation of recognition could damage a military machine that seemed invincible. Emma's teacher is so impressed that he uploads her presentation to YouTube, and something unexpected happens. The video starts getting views, not millions but thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Comment sections fill with people sharing their own family stories of resistance, of grandparents who fought in small ways, of aunts and uncles who hid refugees or sabotaged factories, or passed information to Allied forces. The story of the boy with the wrench becomes a catalyst for a larger conversation about how ordinary people resist tyranny, about how courage doesn't always look like soldiers storming beaches or pilots flying missions. Sometimes courage looks like a 12-year-old crawling under trucks in the middle of the night, risking everything for a victory he'll never be able to claim. The video gets picked up by history podcasts, shared on social media, translated into multiple languages. Emma gets interviewed by local news stations, then national ones, then international ones. She becomes, ironically, the face of a story about someone who deliberately chose to have no face, who valued anonymity over recognition. And while Emma is careful to acknowledge that the saboteur's identity was never confirmed, that the whole story might be historical speculation built on circumstantial evidence, the power of the narrative transcends the question of absolute proof. Because whether or not every detail is exactly as Hermann and Mitchell theorized, the core truth remains undeniable. Someone did this. Someone young and brave and strategic caused massive damage to the Nazi war machine and walked away without ever telling a soul. The renewed interest in the story prompts new research efforts. Historians in Germany, Poland, and Russia begin combing through archives with fresh eyes, looking for any documentation that might confirm or disprove the theory. A researcher in Moscow finds Soviet intelligence reports from 1944 that reference unusually high German vehicle casualty rates in the region during late 43, noting it as a positive development, but attributing it to partisan activity rather than investigating further. A German historian locates the personal diary of one of the Berlin specialists, which includes a fascinating passage about his frustration at being unable to solve what he describes as the depot mystery, and his private suspicion that they were looking for the wrong kind of person. These new findings don't definitively prove anything, but they add layers of corroboration to Herman's original research. More importantly, they keep the story alive in academic circles, ensure that it gets mentioned in new histories of the Eastern Front, guarantee that future students studying World War II resistance will encounter the tale of the unidentified child saboteur who killed 63 SS soldiers with nothing but mechanical knowledge and a stolen wrench. The story becomes part of the historical canon, not as verified fact, but as compelling possibility, as an example of how the gaps in our historical record often contain the most interesting truths. By 2020, the story has taken on a life of its own, evolving beyond any single telling into a kind of modern legend. Artists create paintings imagining the boy under the trucks. Musicians write songs about anonymous resistance. A playwright in Berlin writes a one-act play set in the garage where the boy and his father work, exploring themes of complicity, courage, and the cost of survival under occupation. None of these artistic interpretations claim to know the truth. They're explicitly framed as imaginative responses to a historical mystery, but collectively they ensure that the story keeps circulating, keeps finding new audiences, keeps asking new generations to think about what they would do in similar circumstances. And that question, more than any specific historical fact, is what gives the story its enduring power. What would you do if you were 12 years old living under Nazi occupation? Would you stay invisible and safe, or would you find a way to fight back? Would you accept powerlessness, or would you discover that even the most powerless person has the ability to inflict damage on a system designed to crush them? These are not comfortable questions, and they don't have easy answers, which is precisely why the story matters. It refuses to let us off the hook, refuses to let us believe that resistance is only possible for trained soldiers or connected partisans or people with resources and support networks. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about recognition and validation that resonate in an age of social media and constant performance. The boy, if he existed, if Herman's research was correct, chose silence over fame, chose effectiveness over credit, chose to carry his accomplishment in secret rather than trade it for status or acknowledgement. In a culture where every act of kindness gets posted online, where activism is often indistinguishable from personal branding, where people document their resistance in real time for likes and shares, the idea of someone doing something extraordinary and then simply walking away without telling anyone feels almost alien. Yet that's exactly what makes the story so powerful. The boy didn't fight for recognition. He fought because it was right, because it was necessary, because he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. And when the fighting was done, he returned to ordinary life and let history move on without him. There's something profoundly subversive about that choice, something that challenges our assumptions about why people do heroic things. Maybe the highest form of courage is the kind no one ever knows about. Maybe the most meaningful victories are the ones you carry in silence. Maybe resistance doesn't need an audience to be real. These ideas make people uncomfortable because they suggest that all our performing, all our documenting, all our need for validation might actually be obstacles to genuine resistance rather than expressions of it. The boy with the wrench becomes a mirror reflecting back our own compromises, our own choices to prioritize recognition over action, and that reflection is not always flattering. In 2023, 80 years after the sabotage campaign, a remarkable discovery emerges from an unexpected source. A woman in her late 80s named Katarzyna Nowak, living in a nursing home in Gdansk, Poland, sees Emma Rodriguez's viral presentation shared on a tablet by her granddaughter. Katarzyna watches in silence, her hands trembling slightly, and when it's over, she asks to watch it again, then a third time. Finally, she asks her granddaughter to contact the people who made the video, says she has information about the boy, information she's kept secret for 8 decades. The granddaughter is skeptical. Her grandmother's memory has been failing. She sometimes confuses past and present, mixes up names and dates. But there's something different about this. A clarity in Katarzyna's eyes that suggests she's accessing memories that have remained sharp even as more recent experiences fade. Within a week, a historian from the University of Warsaw arrives at the nursing home with recording equipment, and Katarzyna tells a story that no one expected to hear. She was 11 years old in 1943, living in the same town as the depot. Her family lived 3 houses down from the mechanic and his son. And one night in late October, she couldn't sleep because of a toothache, and she looked out her window and saw the boy. She remembers his name was Piotr, though she's not certain if that's accurate or a detail her memory has invented, crawling out of his house, carrying something that glinted in the moonlight. She watched him disappear toward the depot, watched him return an hour later moving like a shadow, and she never told anyone because even at 11 she understood that seeing things in occupied territory was dangerous. Katarzyna's testimony is simultaneously thrilling and frustrating for researchers. It's the closest thing to eyewitness confirmation that anyone has found, but it's also maddeningly incomplete. She can't remember the boy's last name. She's not absolutely certain about the first name. She can't provide details that would allow historians to definitively identify him through records. Her memory of the night itself is vivid. The moonlight, the way the boy moved, the feeling of fear and admiration mixed together. But the surrounding context is hazy. She remembers the occupation, remembers the SS officers, remembers the trucks, but she can't pinpoint exact dates or provide the kind of corroborating detail that would transform her testimony from interesting anecdote to historical proof. Historians debate whether her account should be taken seriously. Some argue that an 88-year-old woman remembering something from when she was 11 is inherently unreliable, that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, that she might have seen the viral video and unconsciously created a memory that fits the narrative. Others counter that traumatic or emotionally significant memories from childhood can remain remarkably intact across decades, that the specificity of certain details, the glint of metal in moonlight, the particular way the boy moved, suggests genuine recall rather than fabrication. The debate becomes heated in academic circles, with reputations and methodological principles at stake. But for most people following the story, Katarzyna's testimony is enough. It confirms what they wanted to believe all along, that the boy was real, that his resistance happened, that somewhere in the darkness of Nazi occupation, a child fought back and won. The discovery of Katarzyna's testimony reignites interest in the story and prompts a new wave of investigation. Genealogists begin working backward from the town's records, trying to identify all boys who would have been around 12 in 1943 and whose fathers were mechanics. They find 7 possible candidates. 3 can be definitively ruled out based on subsequent records, showing they survived the war and lived lives that make it unlikely they were the saboteur. 2 died during the war itself in circumstances that are documented. That leaves 2 possibilities, both of whom survived into the post-war period, both of whom worked in mechanics or related fields, both of whom left minimal historical traces. One, named Piotr Kowalski, emigrated to Canada in 1951 and died in Thunder Bay in 1983. The other, named Marek Zawadzki, remained in Poland, lived quietly, and died in 1996, the same year that Herman's mysterious correspondent died. The timeline matches perfectly, and suddenly researchers realize they might have been closer to the truth than they thought. Marek Zawadzki becomes the leading candidate, and investigators begin trying to locate anyone who knew him, any surviving relatives who might have stories or documents. They find his daughter, now in her 60s, living in Krakow. She agrees to an interview but warns them that her father never talked about the war, never shared stories, maintained a wall of silence around those years that no amount of questioning could penetrate. The daughter, whose name is Anna, sits for a 3-hour interview that yields very little concrete information, but contains one moment that makes everyone in the room go silent. She's talking about her father's habits, his routines, the small quirks that defined him, and she mentions that he had a wrench, an old battered adjustable wrench, that he kept in a drawer in his workbench. He never used it for actual work, never let anyone else touch it, and when she asked about it as a child, he told her it was a reminder. A reminder of what? She asked. Just a reminder, he said, and that was the end of the conversation. When Anna's father died, she inherited his tools, including the wrench. She still has it stored in her garage in Krakow, never quite able to throw it away even though it serves no practical purpose. The historians ask if they can see it, and Anna retrieves a wooden box from her car. Inside, wrapped in cloth, is a wrench that looks like it could be from the 1940s. The right age, the right style, the kind of tool a mechanic would have used. There's no way to prove this specific wrench was used to loosen lug nuts on Nazi trucks. No forensic test can connect it to vehicles that were destroyed or abandoned 80 years ago. But everyone in that room feels the weight of possibility, understands that they might be holding the weapon that killed 63 SS soldiers, the tool that a 12-year-old boy used to fight back against an empire. Anna agrees to donate the wrench to a museum in Warsaw, where it's displayed with a placard that reads, "Wrench circa 1940s, possibly used in resistance activities during World War II. Provenance uncertain." It's the most honest historical description imaginable, acknowledging both the story's power and its ultimate unverifiability. The wrench becomes something of a pilgrimage site for people who followed the story. They come to the museum, stand in front of the display case and project onto this ordinary tool all their beliefs about resistance, courage, and the power of individual action. Some see it and are inspired to think about what they could do in their own time to fight injustice. Others see it and feel despair that we've reduced heroism to a museum piece, sanitized and safe behind glass. Still others see it and question whether the whole thing is real, or just a compelling story that we've collectively decided to believe, because we need to believe that ordinary people can make a difference. The museum curators are careful not to make definitive claims, always using words like possibly and allegedly, and according to some accounts, but they also understand that the wrench's power has nothing to do with absolute historical certainty. It's a focal point for a story that resonates across time, a physical object that connects us to a moment when someone young and scared chose action over safety. Whether or not this specific wrench was the one doesn't really matter. What matters is that somewhere, somehow, a wrench like this was used for something extraordinary, and that possibility is enough to make people reconsider their own capacity for courage. The story of the boy with the wrench has transcended its origins as a historical mystery and become something closer to myth, a narrative that contains emotional and moral truth, even if the factual details remain forever uncertain. So what do we do with a story like this? A story where the hero's name might be Piotr or Marek or someone else entirely, where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, where the line between history and legend has blurred beyond recognition. The easy answer is to dismiss it, to file it away as an interesting anecdote that can't be verified, and therefore doesn't belong in serious historical discourse. But that answer misses the point entirely, because the power of this story has never been about proving that one specific boy did one specific thing. The power is in what the story reveals about the nature of resistance itself, that it doesn't require armies or weapons or official sanction. That sometimes the most effective fighters are the ones nobody sees coming, the ones who use the tools they have and the knowledge they possess to inflict damage in ways the enemy can't predict or prevent. Whether his name was Piotr or Marek or remains forever unknown, the saboteur of Depot 17 represents thousands of similar stories across occupied Europe: farmers who hid food from requisition squads, factory workers who deliberately slowed production, rail workers who provided intelligence to partisans, teachers who kept forbidden books hidden, parents who sheltered refugee children. These weren't dramatic acts of heroism that got filmed for newsreels. These were quiet, persistent, dangerous choices made by ordinary people who refused to accept that occupation meant submission. And most of them, like our boy with the wrench, never told their stories, never sought recognition, never expected history to remember them. The tragedy is how many of these stories have been lost forever, erased by the very anonymity that kept their actors alive. We'll never know how many children loosened lug nuts or cut phone lines or passed messages. We'll never know how many acts of small sabotage added up to create the conditions that allowed the Allied victory. History records the generals and the battles, the strategic decisions and the turning points, but it barely acknowledges the countless individual moments of resistance that collectively undermined the Nazi war machine from within. The boy with the wrench is unusual, only because enough evidence survived. accident reports, investigation files, a researcher's curiosity, an old woman's memory, to let us glimpse what was probably a common phenomenon. For every story like his that we can piece together from fragments, there are probably hundreds that left no trace at all, that exist now only in the fading memories of elderly survivors who never told anyone what they did or saw. This erasure is not accidental. Occupying forces deliberately suppress these stories because they're dangerous, because they prove that no matter how much military power you deploy, no matter how brutal your enforcement, you can't control a population that refuses to be controlled. The Nazis didn't want anyone to know that a child with a wrench killed 63 of their soldiers. The Soviets didn't want anyone celebrating non-sanctioned resistance that might inspire similar actions against their own occupation. And so the story disappeared, buried under layers of official silence, emerging only decades later when the regimes that suppressed it had themselves collapsed. But here's what makes this story more than just historical curiosity. It's a blueprint that remains relevant today. Because tyranny hasn't disappeared from the world, and occupation takes many forms, not all of them involving soldiers and tanks. When you live under systems designed to crush your agency, to convince you that resistance is futile, to make you believe that one person can't possibly make a difference, the story of a 12-year-old with a wrench becomes a counter-narrative that refuses to accept powerlessness. It says, look what's possible with almost nothing. Look what you can accomplish when you stop waiting for someone else to save you and start using whatever tools you have. Look how invisibility can be a weapon, how patience can be a strategy, how anonymous action can be more powerful than public performance. These lessons apply whether you're facing literal occupation or metaphorical ones, systems of oppression that tell you to stay quiet, stay small, stay powerless. The boy didn't have social media to amplify his message. He didn't have a network to support him. He didn't even have confirmation that his actions would matter. All he had was a wrench, a plan, and the courage to execute it night after night until time ran out. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The other lesson this story teaches is about the relationship between recognition and value. We live in an age obsessed with visibility, where actions that aren't documented and shared feel somehow less real, where resistance that doesn't trend on social media seems pointless. But the boy with the wrench reminds us that the opposite might be true, that the most authentic resistance happens in darkness, without audience, without the corrupting influence of performance and validation. He didn't need anyone to know what he did. He didn't need history books or documentaries or viral videos. He knew, and that was sufficient. There's something almost sacred about that kind of integrity, that refusal to trade meaningful action for empty recognition. It challenges us to ask what we're really fighting for when we resist injustice. Are we fighting to make the world better, or are we fighting to be seen as people who fight to make the world better? The distinction matters enormously. The boy chose effectiveness over credit, impact over optics, and in doing so achieved something that lasted long after he died, not because he documented it, but because the consequences rippled outward in ways he could never track. 63 dead soldiers meant 63 families that didn't get their sons or fathers back, meant gaps in unit rosters that weakened operations, meant other soldiers who heard about the accidents and felt a little less invincible. The boy's silence didn't diminish his impact. If anything, it amplified it because mysteries are more powerful than solved problems, and ghosts are harder to fight than identified enemies. In the end, we don't need to know his name to understand what he did or why it matters. We don't need absolute historical proof to recognize the truth at the story's core, that courage isn't about being fearless or powerful or connected. Courage is about being terrified and powerless and isolated, and doing it anyway, about looking at an impossible situation and refusing to accept impossibility as an answer. The boy with the wrench gave us a gift, and the gift isn't just his resistance but his silence, his refusal to turn his actions into a story he could tell at dinner parties or trade for status. He let his work speak for itself, or rather, he let his work remain silent alongside him, both of them disappearing into history while the consequences echoed forward in time. 80 years later, we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened in Depot 17 in the autumn of 1943. We're still debating names and details, still searching archives for proof, still arguing about whether an 88-year-old woman's memory can be trusted. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Maybe the uncertainty is the point. Because as long as we don't know for sure, as long as the mystery remains unsolved, the story stays alive, keeps asking questions, keeps challenging us to imagine what we would do in similar circumstances. The boy with the wrench isn't just a historical figure. He's a mirror reflecting back our own choices, our own compromises, our own untested capacity for courage. And that reflection, uncomfortable as it is, might be the most valuable thing a story can offer. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but possibility. Not a hero to worship, but an example to consider when you're standing in your own darkness, holding your own wrench, deciding whether to stay safe or fight back. What will you choose?